Hey there, my name is Alex, I am the Silvermond, and this video has a very simple but ultimately pointless mark to discuss the mightiest weapons in the Souls franchise. This isn't a top 10, and for the most part we're not going to be talking about practicality from a gameplay perspective, but rather the mythical weapons of lore, from the Greatsword of Artorius to the Moonlight Greatsword. There's a lot of weapons in the Souls franchise though. I'm not going to talk about all of them, just a few of my favourites. And of course, if you've any questions or just want to point out something I missed or bring up your own favourite weapon, do share in the comments section down below or on Twitter. That out of the way, let's get started. And where better to start than with a blade from the first game, Demon's Souls.
I am old King Doran, and thou hast proven thine strength to me. Go forth and take the king's sword in thine hand.
And when I say Northern Regalia, I am of course talking about Bramd and Bramd. Together they make the Northern Regalia, the regalia of the Northern Kingdom of Boletaria, the setting of Demon's Souls. Legacy of the old Boletaria kings, the shadow this sword casts is of both the Bramd and the Bramd. Little is known of its origin even in Boletarian royal family lore, but it is said to have been left in the world along with the old one for malicious purposes. Bramd, the Black Blade, can be compared in some ways to Vendrick's Greatsword. Both are the favoured sword of their respective kings and both scale with the wielder's soul. But whilst Vendrick's sword grows more powerful the more souls the wielder has in their possession, Bramd grows more powerful the darker the wielder's soul. Conversely, should one attempt to wield it with a pure white character tendency, the blade's power will be extremely underwhelming. It is said old King Alant favoured Bramd for this very purpose, and as we know, so twisted by demonic power was he that he fully lost his human form in the end. But what about Bramd? Effectively the opposite. The white sword grows more powerful with a benevolent wielder, and is particularly effective against demons. King Alant wasn't so keen on it, in fact he spurned the blade. But King Doran, the founder of Boletaria, will test those who seek the blade, and should one worthy present themselves, he will allow them to claim it. When combined, Bramd and Bramd form the Northern Regalia, a weapon that boasts immense power. The wielder simply needs to have a pure black or pure white tendency. In other words, whether the character is extremely evil or extremely benevolent, the blade will unleash its true strength. All in all, a well-rounded blade that is effective against both man and demon, the Northern Regalia is quite possibly the most powerful weapon in Demon's Souls. And it also makes an almost not quite cameo in Bloodborne. Martyr Logarius wields a blade eerily similar in shape. And speaking of weapons that show up under various names and guises.
Surely mankind are more than pure dark. I beg of the spread of the abyss must be stopped.
Off the top of my head, I cannot think of a weapon that has shown up so many times as this one. Certainly the Moonlight Sword shows up in just about every title, but the Blade of Artorius, it shows up 3 times in Dark Souls 1 alone. The Greatsword of Artorius has 2 versions, a cursed version and a normal version. And then we have the Abyss version that can be obtained in the Artorius of the Abyss DLC. For the sake of this video, we'll refer to the 2 identically named versions as Greatsword of Artorius and Darkslayer. Darkslayer being the default non-cursed version. That is the blade's name in the German version of the game, and it's handy for instances like this. So why are there 2 different versions? Well, the Darkslayer is the blade with which Artorius hunted the Dark Wraiths, whereas the Greatsword was cursed when Artorius entered into a covenant with the creatures of the Abyss, which allows it to damage ghostly enemies in the game. As for exactly who or what the creatures of the Abyss are, we can't know for certain. I do like the idea that Sif is a creature of the Abyss, as a pet theory, but it somewhat falls apart when put under scrutiny. Alvina could be another bet. What we know for certain though, is that Artorius wielded some of the best equipment anyone has ever had access to throughout Dark Souls. Weapons, armour, trinkets, and shields all forged presumably by the gods Divine and Blacksmith. Alas, none of that saved him, but his blade has been passed down through the years in one form or another, starting with the Abyss Greatsword, a twisted mockery of Artorius and the gods. This blade scales with the wielder's humanity, so tainted by the Abyss is it. Whereas in Dark Souls 2 we have the majestic Greatsword, a blade of unknown origin that was once wielded by Gordon of Ferosa. Interestingly enough, the Ivory King comes from Ferosa, and some speculate connections between Ferosa's war god, Faram, and the Nameless King, Gwyn's firstborn son. Finally, in Dark Souls 3 we have the Wolf Knight Greatsword, which appears to be the original Darkslayer version, Artorius at this point being the Wolf Blood Master, the first Abyss Watcher. All of the Abyss Watchers fight in a manner very reminiscent of the Beast Artorius. When we fought Artorius, his left arm, his shield arm, was shattered, and funnily enough, the Abyss Watchers all wield their swords in their right hand and parrying daggers in their left. They seem to despise the use of shields. Funny, because I imagine Artorius cherished being able to safeguard Sith using the magic of his own great shield. A mighty weapon against the dark then, but as is often the case, the dark eventually conquers all, and even this divine blade eventually became a weapon of darkness. But it could be worse.
Dear me, why would you do such a thing?
The Avelyn is unique in Dark Souls. No other weapon category is made up of entirely useless weapons save one. And when I say useless, I don't truly mean it. But let's look at it briefly from a PvP perspective. If someone pulls out any crossbow, you'll probably laugh it off as it's not going to be much of a threat. But the Avelyn, in Dark Souls it was rather frightening. In Dark Souls 2 we had people wielding 2 of them and things got a little out of hand. But what is the Avelyn? We can assume that the Avelyn was originally created by weapon craftsman Eidos, or Eidos, but we don't know that for certain, only that he cherished it. Throughout the series it has been regarded not only as a weapon but a piece of art. In Dark Souls 2 it was recreated by a rich merchant who read about it in an ancient book. In Dark Souls 3 it is likened to a musical instrument, and it certainly is an intricate piece of equipment. The repeating crossbow was located in Seath's archives in the first game, Grand Archives in the third game, and deep in the Undead Crypt in the second game. It is worth noting that the final boss of the Dark Souls franchise, Slave Knight Gale, uses a crude imitation of the Avelyn, simply known as Repeating Crossbow. His version is rusty, dented, brittle and ugly, but certainly an effective weapon. There is probably no connection between the two, however. Gale's is almost certainly a reference to the character Guts from the manga Berserk, from which the Souls franchise has taken much inspiration. As far as crossbows go though, I think many players would agree that Avelyn is the definitive Dark Souls crossbow. And next up we have another classic weapon that has popped up time and again throughout the franchise, one heavily associated with a recurring type of character to boot.
Are you dead already? Oh, you deserve it.
If you ask someone to name a weapon that has been in all of the Souls games, I think most people would first list the Moonlight Blade. Perhaps even the Artorius or Chaos Blade. But whilst it's not as glamorous as many of those, this large axe has certainly been around. In Demon Souls we called it the Meat Cleaver, in Dark Souls and Dark Souls 3 the Butcher Knife, and in Dark Souls 2 the Butcher's Knife. And some incarnations of the weapon have been accompanied by a stout, man-eating woman. In Demon Souls, the Meat Cleaver was the Adjudicator's weapon that turned sinners into delicious-looking cuts of meat. Sadly though, it has no real connection with Executioner Marauder. In Dark Souls though, it is used both by the supposedly female butcher enemies and the man-eater Mildred. Should you pummel her into submission, she will assist you in fighting Quelaag, using her trusty knife. In Dark Souls 2 it is created from the Rotten Soul, and the description alludes to its past usage as a butcher's knife used on human flesh. Bizarrely enough, Melinda the Butcher does not use the weapon, but she does show up in the Rotten's area and appears to be similar to Mildred. She uses a weapon more akin to Marauder's axe, although it is worth noting that all of these weapons are still the same category, Great Axe, and all of these women, well, their name begins with M, and they are perhaps a little deranged. In Dark Souls 3, in fact, we have an unnamed Madwoman NPC who strongly resembles Man-Eater Mildred, and uses the Butcher Knife. This odd woman from the Undead Settlement used the fearsome weapon to aid in her a human appetite. Whilst it's not a divine weapon, or perhaps even a particularly storied one, the butcher knife has appeared time and again, and is perhaps a result of Dark Souls and its, well, dark humour. Not the strongest weapon, but it is thematic of humans and their overwhelming appetites, methinks. But let's move on to a more elegant weapon, from a more civilised time.
Dragons shall never be forgotten. We knights fought valiantly, but for every one of them, we lost 70 of our own.
The longest and heaviest weapon we'll be talking about today. And there's a reason it's so long and so heavy. Ornstein's spear wasn't for cutting up humans. It wasn't even used for vanquishing dark beasts. It was, of course, for slaying dragons. Ornstein's cross-spear could shatter the stone scales of archdragons and was imbued with the sun-lightning power of his king and god, Gwyn. Combined with Ornstein's acrobatic combat style, you can see why he was named captain of Gwyn's 4 knights. The Lion Knight was unmatched throughout the realm of gods, aside from perhaps the Wolf Knight, Artorius. As of Dark Souls 3, we know that Ornstein's weapon has the base of its design in the Nameless King's sword spear. You might say that Ornstein's was the natural evolution of such a weapon. A deific hunter of dragons, the Nameless King could well have taken Ornstein as his protege. But who is stronger, student or master? Is the Dragonslayer spear mightier than the sword spear? Well, we have no way of knowing, of course, but I am of the opinion that Nameless King is stronger than Ornstein on account of his heritage, whereas the Dragonslayer spear is the more advanced weapon, the more storied, the more famous. Although it is worth noting, of course, that the sword spear has a higher attack rating. In my opinion, though, it is a rather unwieldy, clumsy looking weapon, when compared to the spear at any rate. Ornstein's spear has been a mainstay throughout the franchise. The Lion Knight exudes style and grace, and his weapon is not only beautiful, but arguably one of the strongest weapons in the first game. If you've ever fought a good counterattacker using the Leo Ring, you can attest for that yourself. On the topic of beautiful weapons though, the next one may be the most beautiful of them all.
Even in this darkest of nights, I see the moonlight.
The Moonlight Sword, the large sword of Moonlight, the old Moonlight, the holy Moonlight Sword, the Moonlight Greatsword. No matter the name, it is a famous weapon. It has been in Kingsfield, Demon Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Otogi, Ninja Blade, and Armored Core. If any weapon could be considered FromSoft's mascot, it would certainly be the Moonlight Sword. There's even an RPG Maker style program named after it. But what is it? Unfortunately, I can only really speak for the Souls versions, as I've not played Kingsfield, the origin of the weapon. But in Souls, the first incarnation was the large sword of Moonlight, wielded by Moonlight Knight Vito, or Vito. It is one of the few revelations from God, which could suggest a connection with the old one. In Bloodborne, it is an arcane sword discovered by Ludwig. He refers to it as his guiding moonlight, and is perhaps the most famous wielder of the most powerful incarnation of the blade to date. But what about in Dark Souls? Initially, it was thought to be nothing more than a dragon weapon that came from the tale of Seath the Scaleless. Seath, the grandfather of sorcery, and a blade imbued with his magic. For years, we assumed this was the origin of the blade. In Dark Souls 2, we had not one but 2 incarnations, the first wielded by a knight encountered early in the game, Benhart of Jugo. The Blue Moon Greatsword, however, appears to be a fake. Benhart is unaware of this, but knows of the weapon's legend, that it was born of a great white being. Without a doubt, he speaks of the same sword stemming from Seath. As for Dark Souls 3, the blade is created from the soul of Oceiros, and once again associated with Seath. Oceiros searched for Moonlight, but it never revealed itself to him. What could that mean? I find that an interesting parallel with Ludwig. But if the Moonlight never revealed itself to him, surely it must have, for the blade can be created from his soul. Well, that's where Medea comes in. Using the abyss-corrupted soul of the Great Dragon, it is possible to create a potent sorcery known as Old Moonlight, a memory of an old sword named after Moonlight, but slightly different from Seath's version. Perhaps it is rooted in an older memory, from not long after the beginning. Is this a reference to Kingsfield? Most probably. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Did Seath know of this too, and fashion a similar blade using his magic? Was this the Moonlight that Osiris searched for? Why does Midir know of it? Was he granted a soul belonging to an ancient Moonlight Knight? What about Benhart? Was all of this a precursor to an upcoming Kingsfield game? Whatever the case, it has been one of my favourite weapons in every game it shows up in. The simple, ethereal beauty of the blade is rather rapturous. But there's another weapon, one that is known like the Moonlight Blade for its allure, but also known for driving those who wield it mad.
Have you heard of Chaos Blade, the legendary sword of the ancient undead master Makoto? Its blade a swirling vortex.
I'll do anything to have it.
Whilst it hasn't been in as many games as the Moonlight Sword, the Chaos Blade, known as the Magic Sword Makoto in Demon Souls, and the Ninja Blade in Ninja Blade, you might argue that it is the most powerful on this list, purely from a gameplay sense at least. In Dark Souls 1, 2 and 3, it has been one of the strongest weapons available to the player, high attack rating, good bleed values, fast and with amazing reach. In Dark Souls 2 in particular, it dominated the PvP scene for a good time. In Demon Souls, it is bizarrely rather outclassed by the katana wielded by the very man who seeks it. As for Ninja Blade, considering it's the titular weapon, it is rather powerful. So what is the Chaos Blade? In its purest form, a mysterious cursed katana that drains the life force of its wielder. In Dark Souls, the first incarnation is born from Quelaag, a being twisted by chaos. In the second game, it is simply remarked upon as an alluring vortex and a lonely soul. Sadly, it has no connection or any interesting interactions with the Ivory King or the Old Chaos. In the third game, it has its most apt description yet. The blade is not unlike a thing misshapen, granted life, but never welcome in this world. In other words, chaos itself. As for the Magic Sword Makoto, it was named for a giant in a distant country in Demon Souls. The wounds it inflicts never heal. And even though it is a cursed weapon, warriors unable to fight the allure will seek the blade. Satsuki claims the blade as a keepsake of his father and warns us against it. Whether or not he speaks true, we can't say for certain, but one thing is certain. Should you withhold the blade, Satsuki will attack you. Should you grant him the blade, he will also attack you. Either way, overpowered by its unworldly perfection, driven mad by its vortex. And in Dark Souls, Shiva of the East mirrored Satsuki's plotline almost exactly. If you're interested in that, you can see more about it in a lore video I have linked in the description. All in all, the Chaos Blade is a typical cursed weapon, powerful yet deadly to the wielder, something perhaps left better alone. How does it fare against the others here? Whilst it may be the best from a gameplay perspective, which of these mighty weapons is king? It is a very hard question, as so much of the strength of these weapons stems from their users. But what if, say, several clones of Gwyn were fighting and each one wielded one of these weapons? I think it would have to come down to the Chaos Blade or Moonlight Sword personally. My own favourite though? The Dragonslayer Spear, as I'm a spear person. And purely from a realistic perspective, it would probably be either the Artorius Blade or the Dragonslayer Spear. The Chaos Blade as a katana would be very brittle. The Butcher Knife is an impractical weapon. The Avelyn would likewise be rather impractical. The Moonlight Sword is magical, so it's impossible to say, but the Artorius Blade looks extremely versatile, and the Dragonslayer Spear, well, if you had the strength to wield it, it would be one hell of a weapon. And I know some people will be interested in this, so before we wrap up, let's look at the weapons purely from a numbers perspective, their attack ratings. Of course, you have to keep in mind some of these are from different games, so the numbers don't really mean much. That said, the Northern Regalia has an attack rating of 540. The Greatsword of Artorius, also known as Darkslayer, has a maximum attack rating of 720. The Cursed version is 587. The Abyss Greatsword version is 612. And just because, the Wolf Knight Greatsword from Dark Souls 3 has an attack rating of 613. Why did there have to be 50 versions of his sword? Avelyn has an AR of 267, 170 in Dark Souls 2, and 128 in Dark Souls 3. The Butcher Knife is 584 in Demon Souls as the Meat Cleaver, 462 in Dark Souls, 476 in Dark Souls 2, and 466 in Dark Souls 3. Ornstein's Spear is 563, 513, and 552. The Moonlight Sword is 355, 520, 380, 626, and 632 in Bloodborne. I feel that is somewhat appropriate for Bloodborne to have the most powerful version. Finally, the Chaos Blade is 300 as the Magic Sword Makoto, 485, 410, and 500. And just for some final semi-related notes, the weapons with the highest attack rating from each game. Keep in mind this is with no infusions and no buffs, just 99 in every stat. For Demon Souls, it's the Meat Cleaver at 584. For Dark Souls, it's the Greatsword of Artorius at 720. For Dark Souls 2, it's the Sacred Chime Hammer at 865. And for Dark Souls 3, it's the Dancer's Swords at 862. Yes, it is split over 1,000,000 damage types. And Bloodborne, I believe it's the Moonlight Blade at 632. So what can we take away from all this? Clearly, Velstart is the strongest character of all. That was a lot of numbers. Finally, I just want to give an honourable mention to a few of my favourite weapons across the series. The Silver Knight Straight Sword, the Lois Greatsword, the Astora Greatsword, and the Greatsword of Judgment. Such beautiful weapons. And I can't forget the trusty halberd. It might not be the most fancy weapon, but it's done me good. What are your favourite weapons? Let me know in the comments, or on Twitter at TheSilvermont. And if you'd like to support my channel and get access to an exclusive Discord channel where you can talk to me and a bunch of other people, check out my Patreon linked in the description. Well, I hope this video was entertaining. Catch you next time for more pointless trivia. Take care.